There are two texts from the ancient world that reach almost the same conclusion about suffering, equanimity, and the interior life. And they were written within roughly a century of each other, in the same Mediterranean world, by men who had no knowledge of each other. One was written by a Roman emperor from the most powerful position in the ancient world. The other was written by a Jewish tent maker from a prison cell. The convergence is not incidental. It is one of the most philosophically interesting facts about both texts, and it is almost never discussed directly. I have read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius and Paul's letter to the Philippians in the same week, more than once, and the experience is always strange, not because they say identical things, they do not, but because they are clearly wrestling with the same problem from different directions, and the distance between where they arrive tells you something essential about both frameworks that neither text reveals on its own. Let's start with what they share, because the convergence is real and worth taking seriously before we examine where it breaks down. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations sometime in the 160s and 170s CE, almost certainly never intending them for publication. They are private notes, the record of a man in one of history's most demanding positions trying to hold himself to a standard he believed was attainable through reason and practice. He was commanding Roman armies on the Danube frontier, managing an empire under plague, and dealing with military, political, and personal losses of considerable weight. The Meditations are, among other things, a field manual for staying sane under sustained pressure. The core of Marcus's Stoic framework is a distinction that he returns to in almost every book of the Meditations, the distinction between what is up to us and what is not. The Greek term the Stoics used was to ephemen, that which is in our power. This includes our judgments, our desires, our responses to events, our interior orientation. Everything else, wealth, reputation, health, what other people do, whether our plans succeed, falls outside this boundary. Stoic practice, in its simplest form, is the sustained effort to locate your investment exclusively in the first category and achieve genuine indifference to the second. Marcus writes in Book 6, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." In Book 5, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." These are not decorative maxims. They are operational instructions for a specific practice, meeting every obstacle not as a disruption to be resisted, but as material that the disciplined interior can work with and through. What is often missed about the Meditations is how concrete and repetitive the practice is. Marcus is not writing philosophy in the academic sense. He is doing what a person does when they are trying to build a habit and keep failing at it. He writes the same instructions to himself across 12 books because he keeps needing to hear them. Book 7 contains the instruction to begin each day with the expectation that other people will be difficult, ungrateful, dishonest, and short-sighted. And to begin with the further instruction that none of this is grounds for disturbance, because they are acting from ignorance, and because disturbance serves no one. He writes this not once, but across dozens of variations, because he needs to preload the response before the situation arrives, and because he knows his own mind well enough to know that in the heat of an interaction, the unprepared mind will default to reactive emotion rather than deliberate response. Book 4 contains what I think is the most honest sentence in the entire text. Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. It reads, depending on your circumstances when you encounter it, either as a profound liberation or as an almost unbearable demand. If you are someone whose circumstances are tolerable and whose interior is disordered, it is liberating. If you are someone whose circumstances are genuinely severe and whose interior is the only resource you have left, it is a demand that admits no excuse. Marcus himself was writing it from a position of considerable external demand. He knew what it cost. The faculty that does this work, for Marcus, is what he calls the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the guiding mind. The health of the person is the health of this faculty. when it judges correctly, when it is not swept by what Marcus calls passions, automatic emotional reactions to external events, when it sees clearly and responds with deliberate intention rather than reactive impulse, the person is well regardless of what is happening outside them. The emperor on the frontier and the slave in the city are, in principle, in the same position relative to what matters. Both have access to the faculty that determines the quality of their interior life, and neither's circumstances can take that access away. This is the foundation. Now read Philippians 4:11. Paul writes from prison, almost certainly Roman imprisonment, probably awaiting a verdict, to a community he established in Philippi, which was itself a Roman military colony. The letter is warm, personal, full of practical instruction, and contains one of the densest concentrations of theological argument in the entire Pauline corpus. In verse 11, after thanking the Philippians for their material support, he writes, "Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content." The word translated as content is autarx. It is a Greek word with a specific philosophical pedigree. It means self-sufficient, self-contained, requiring nothing from outside for its own sufficiency. It is the Stoic ideal word. It is the word a Stoic philosopher would use to describe the sage who has achieved genuine independence from external circumstance. Marcus Aurelius would recognize it immediately. Paul is writing to a Roman military colony where Stoic philosophy shaped educated public discourse. His use of autarx is deliberate. He is reaching into the vocabulary his audience knows, the vocabulary of Stoic self-sufficiency, and applying it to his own experience in prison. The claim is, I have achieved what your philosophers are reaching for. I am autarx. And then, in verse 12, he specifies, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. This is an exact parallel to Marcus's framework of indifference to external circumstances. Plenty and hunger, abundance and need. These are the categories that Stoic practice aims to make irrelevant to the quality of the interior life. Paul is describing the same achievement. Verse 13 is where the apparent convergence breaks. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. The autarx, the self-sufficiency, is not self-generated, it is received. Paul does not claim to have cultivated this through the sustained rational practice that the Stoics prescribe. He claims to have learned it. The word is memethika, a verb of sustained acquired learning, through a source outside himself. The independence from external circumstance is real, but it is not independent of a relationship. This is the first and most important point of divergence, and it runs deeper than it might initially appear. For Marcus, the project of achieving equanimity under pressure is entirely immanent. It is something the human mind can accomplish through its own rational resources. The Stoics believed in something like divine reason, the logos permeating the universe. But the individual's access to this reason came through the development of their own rational faculty. The strength was in you, developed by you, available to you in proportion to your practice. The sage who achieves autarx has done so by the systematic purification of his own judgment. For Paul, the structure is different at its root. The strength is not developed, it is received. The equanimity is not a personal achievement, but a gift that flows through a relationship. When he writes in Philippians 4:7 that the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds, the architecture is entirely different from Marcus's. Marcus's peace is the achievement of a mind that understands clearly. Paul's peace surpasses understanding. It is operative precisely where understanding runs out. This matters practically. Marcus's framework has a vulnerability that his text is honest about. It depends on the continued function of the rational faculty itself. When grief, illness, extreme exhaustion, or sustained crisis impairs the hegemonicon, the Stoic practice loses its leverage. Marcus writes in several places with visible concern about this. The worry that the faculty he depends on might itself become unreliable. He does not resolve this worry. He simply prescribes more practice. The clearest example of this limitation is in Book 5, where Marcus writes to himself, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly." This is preemptive rational preparation, loading the correct judgment before the emotion can form in response to the event. It works, up to a point. The point where it stops working is the point where the emotion is not triggered by external events, but by something closer to the self's own interior. Grief at a death, the specific weight of prolonged isolation, the kind of exhaustion that does not respond to instruction. These are the territories where Marcus's instructions become less a manual and more a record of aspiration. He loses a son, Verus, in childhood. He loses his co-emperor, Lucius Verus, to plague in 169 CE. He presides over the Antonine Plague, which kills somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the empire during his reign. The Meditations do not read as the work of a man who found these events fully resolvable by the application of correct judgment. They read as the work of a man who kept returning to the practice precisely because the practice kept being exceeded by what he was required to absorb. That honesty is part of what makes the text permanently valuable. It does not claim to have solved the problem. It claims to be trying, repeatedly, from the same imperfect position from which everyone else is also trying. Paul catalogues his own circumstances in 2 Corinthians 11, a passage that serves as something like his personal Stoic credentials. Shipwrecks, 3 times flogged with rods, once stoned and left for dead. A night and a day adrift at sea, constant danger, hunger, cold, the daily pressure of concern for his communities. This is not theoretical resilience. This is resilience tested at a scale that would break most systematic philosophical practices. And his testimony is not that the rational faculty held firm under this pressure. His testimony is that something else held when his own resources ran out. The second major divergence is in the direction of the practice. Marcus's Stoicism is, at its best, a practice of self-withdrawal from external claims. The discipline aims to make the person progressively less dependent on what happens outside, less vulnerable to what others do, less disturbed by the outcomes of events they cannot control. The movement is inward, the cultivation of a self that does not need what it cannot control. This is genuinely impressive and genuinely difficult, and the Meditations are one of the most honest records of what it costs to attempt it. Paul's framework moves in the opposite direction. In Philippians 2:3-4, immediately before the passage about humility and the mind of Christ, he writes, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." The interior stability Paul describes in chapter 4 is not an end in itself. It is the foundation for a specific orientation toward others. The stability that makes genuine self-giving possible. The peace that surpasses understanding is what allows the Philippian community to function as a body, rather than as a collection of self-sufficient individuals, each managing their interior lives in isolation. This is not a minor difference. The Stoic ideal, taken to its logical conclusion, produces the sage, the individual who has achieved complete self-sufficiency and is therefore genuinely free. The Pauline ideal, taken to its logical conclusion, produces community, the collection of people whose interior stability flows from a shared source and is therefore oriented outward, toward each other and toward the world. The third divergence is in what the framework does with suffering itself. Marcus's treatment of suffering is honest and genuinely impressive. He does not deny that pain is real. He does not suggest that the Stoic sage does not feel it. What he suggests is that the judgment we apply to pain, the interpretation we place on it, is within our control, and that the suffering is always less than the self we bring to it. The mind is larger than what afflicts it. This is a real and useful claim, but it is a framework of containment. The Stoic does not find meaning in the suffering, The suffering is simply something that happens, that the rational faculty can, with sufficient practice, decline to be destroyed by. There is no sense in which the suffering contributes to something. Virtue is achieved through practice, and suffering can be one of the conditions in which practice is applied, but the suffering itself is morally neutral at best. Paul's framework does something different. Romans 5:3-5. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. The sequence is causal. The suffering is not merely survived, it produces. Endurance is the output of pressure held through relationship. Character is the output of endurance. Hope, a specific hope with content, oriented toward a specific promise, is the output of character. This is not the Stoic framework. The Stoic does not expect suffering to produce anything beyond the opportunity to practice. Paul describes a suffering that goes somewhere, that participates in a process with a direction and an end. The difference between containment and transformation is the difference between surviving well and being genuinely changed by the going through. What the convergence reveals, ultimately, is this. Marcus Aurelius and Paul were both right, that the interior quality of a life is not determined by its external circumstances. Both were right that there is a resource available to the person under pressure that external circumstances cannot simply take away. Both were right that this resource must be developed or received before the pressure arrives, not in the middle of it. The reason this comparison is worth sitting with is not that it settles anything. It does not. What it does is sharpen the question. If you find Marcus genuinely persuasive, if the rational, immanent, self-sufficient account of equanimity under pressure seems to you like a sufficient account of what a human life requires, then Paul's testimony is an interesting document from a man who arrived at a similar destination by a different route. If you find Paul persuasive, Marcus is a sobering demonstration of how far the rational faculty can actually take a person. Very far, further than most of us will go, and to a boundary that is real and visible in the text of the meditations themselves. If you are somewhere between both positions, which is probably where most honest readers end up, the comparison gives you something more useful than either text gives alone. A precise map of where the two frameworks agree and where they genuinely diverge, which is also a map of what the actual question is. The actual question is not whether equanimity is possible. Both texts say it is. The question is what happens at the boundary where the rational faculty reaches its own limit, where the practice of correct judgment runs out of traction, not because the person failed to practice, but because the circumstances exceeded what any practice can absorb. Marcus's answer is to prescribe more practice and to be honest about the difficulty. Paul's answer is a testimony that there is something available at that boundary that is not generated from within. Neither answer is verifiable from outside the life that tests it. Both are available to be tested. Where they diverge tells you what question each text is ultimately answering. The meditations are answering the question, how do I hold myself together under sustained pressure when I have no reason to expect anything beyond more pressure? The answer is rigorous, honest, and has held up for 2,000 years precisely because it asks nothing that the human rational faculty cannot, with enormous effort, provide. Philippians is answering a different question. What happens when the pressure reaches the place where the rational faculty itself fails? And is there something on the other side of that? Paul says yes, from a prison cell, with his credentials listed in 2 Corinthians for verification. And the most uncomfortable part of his answer, for the person who finds Marcus genuinely persuasive, is that it is not a philosophical claim. It is a testimony. He is not arguing that there is something on the other side of the limit. He is reporting that he has been there. The question each of these texts leaves you with is the same. Which of the two frameworks do your actual circumstances, not your theoretical preferences, actually require?